What if the most dominant car of the season is hiding something nobody noticed during the race? Because after the Chinese Grand Prix, Red Bull engineers started analyzing the data from Shanghai. And what they believe they found could completely change the story of the 2026 championship. Mercedes did not just win the race. They dominated the entire weekend. Pole position, sprint victory, and a comfortable 1-2 finish on Sunday. But on the longest straight of the circuit, something unusual appeared in the telemetry. While every other team suffered hybrid power drop near the end of the straight, the Mercedes cars kept accelerating. Smooth. Stable. Almost like the electrical energy never ran out. According to engineers inside rival teams, that behavior should not normally happen under the 2026 power unit limits. Which raises a very uncomfortable question for the rest of the grid. Did Mercedes simply build the most efficient hybrid engine in Formula One? Or did Red Bull just uncover a hidden advantage that could force the FIA to step in? Because if the new evidence from the Chinese Grand Prix is confirmed, the biggest technical controversy of the 2026 season may have just begun. Subscribe to the channel, because what Red Bull discovered after Shanghai might change the championship fight completely. At first, the Chinese Grand Prix looked like a simple story of dominance. Mercedes arrived in Shanghai already looking strong. From the first practice session, the W17 appeared calm, balanced, and incredibly efficient. George Russell immediately went to the top of the timing sheets. Kimi Antonelli followed closely behind. Lap after lap, the two Mercedes drivers looked completely comfortable with the car. Through the fast corners, the W17 stayed planted. Through the technical sections, the drivers could attack without fighting the rear of the car. And when the cars reached the long straights, the difference became impossible to ignore. Mercedes simply pulled away. By the time qualifying arrived, the pattern was already clear. Antonelli delivered a stunning lap to take pole position. Russell secured second place. A front row lockout for Mercedes. Behind them, Ferrari tried to stay close. Lewis Hamilton qualified third. Charles Leclerc fourth. But the gap was there. Small on paper, yet large enough to confirm that Mercedes had something extra in Shanghai. Then came the race. And the most revealing moment happened almost immediately. Lights out. Hamilton launched brilliantly from the grid. For a few seconds, the Ferrari actually moved ahead of both Mercedes cars. The crowd saw something unexpected. A Ferrari leading into the first sector. But as the field approached the long back straight, everything changed. Antonelli tucked into the slipstream. Closed the gap. Then pulled out earlier than most drivers normally would. Usually, a driver waits until the very end of the straight before attempting an overtake. That way the slipstream effect is stronger. But Antonelli did not need to wait. Even after leaving the draft early, the Mercedes kept accelerating. Closing the distance. Pulling alongside. And finally passing the Ferrari before the braking zone. Clean. Smooth. Almost effortless. For most fans watching the race, it simply looked like a fast car making a normal pass. But inside several rival garages, engineers immediately began studying that moment. Because the acceleration pattern of the Mercedes looked different. Not dramatic. Not obvious. But unusual enough to raise questions. Normally, during a straight that long, the hybrid system begins to lose electrical deployment near the end. The battery runs out of deployable energy. The engine note changes slightly. Acceleration flattens. Drivers call this clipping. It happens to almost every car on the grid. Ferrari experienced it. Red Bull experienced it. Most teams experienced it several times during the race. But the Mercedes cars appeared to delay that moment longer than everyone else. Their acceleration stayed strong deeper into the straight. Almost all the way to the braking zone. And that detail caught the attention of Red Bull engineers. Because under the 2026 regulations, every team works with the same hybrid energy limits. the same battery capacity, the same maximum electrical output. Which means the advantage cannot come from simply using more energy. It has to come from how that energy is managed. And that realization is exactly what triggered Red Bull's deeper investigation after the race. Because if Mercedes had discovered a smarter way to deploy hybrid power, the implications could be enormous. Not just for one race, but for the entire 2026 championship. And the more Red Bull studied the telemetry from Shanghai, the more one specific detail began to stand out. The Mercedes power delivery looked almost perfectly smooth. Not aggressive. Not spiky. Just a long, steady wave of acceleration. And that detail pointed toward something far more complicated than simple engine power. It pointed toward the software controlling the entire hybrid system. And in modern Formula One, that is often where the biggest secrets are hidden. And this is where the story begins to get much more interesting. Because modern Formula One power units are not controlled only by hardware. They are controlled by software. Extremely complex software. Thousands of lines of code that decide exactly when energy is harvested, when it is stored, and when it is deployed. Every braking zone becomes an opportunity to recover electrical energy. Every corner exit becomes a decision about how much of that energy should be released. And those decisions are not made randomly. They are carefully programmed by engineers who spend months optimizing the behavior of the hybrid system. This means that two engines with the same hardware can behave very differently on track. Not because one has more power, but because one manages that power more efficiently. And this is exactly what Red Bull engineers began to suspect after studying the telemetry from Shanghai. When they compared their own data with what they could observe from the Mercedes cars, something unusual appeared. The energy deployment curve of the Mercedes power unit looked almost perfectly smooth. Instead of releasing electrical power in aggressive bursts, the system appeared to deliver it gradually. A slow, controlled stream of energy. Which meant the battery was not being drained as quickly. And that small difference allowed the Mercedes to maintain hybrid assistance for longer on the straight. Even just 1 extra second of electrical deployment can create a significant speed advantage. On a straight as long as the one in Shanghai, that difference becomes extremely visible. The car keeps accelerating. The gap begins to grow. And suddenly overtaking becomes almost impossible. This is exactly what happened during the race. Ferrari could stay close through the corners. Other cars could match the Mercedes in the middle sector. But the moment the straight began, the W17 slowly pulled away. Not violently. Not dramatically. Just steadily increasing the distance. And this pattern repeated itself throughout the entire Grand Prix. For Red Bull engineers, that consistency was the most important clue. Because if the advantage came from simple engine power, the acceleration would look more aggressive. Instead, the Mercedes looked efficient. Calm. Controlled. Almost like the system was stretching every unit of energy as far as possible. Now, to be clear, none of this automatically means Mercedes has done anything illegal. Formula One engineers are always searching for smarter ways to use the technology within the rules. Sometimes the difference comes from aerodynamics. Sometimes from mechanical grip. And sometimes from software. But history has shown that when a team finds a particularly clever interpretation of the regulations, the rest of the grid starts asking questions. And that is exactly what Red Bull appears to be doing now. Because the more they examined the race data from Shanghai, the more one possibility started to emerge. What if Mercedes had not increased the amount of hybrid energy available, but simply found a better way to distribute it across the lap? If that is the case, the advantage could be enormous. Because the 2026 regulations place strict limits on total energy. But they leave small areas open regarding how that energy is delivered. And in Formula One, those small areas are where the most important innovations are often born. Which means the dominant performance we saw from Mercedes in China may not only be the result of a fast car. It may be the result of a system that understands the new hybrid rules better than anyone else. And if Red Bull's new evidence proves correct, the real battle of the 2026 season might not be decided only on the track. It could be decided inside the rulebook, where engineers, teams, and the FIA will eventually have to answer one very important question. Did Mercedes simply build the most efficient power unit in Formula One? Or did Red Bull just uncover the first major loophole of the 2026 era?